How's it going, everyone? Mountainspyder here, bringing you another episode in the Pokemon TCG series. So today is finally the August top 10 theme decks. Now, this is definitely a much anticipated video and something I've been looking forward to doing. I've been putting this off because I've been waiting for the Galarian Darmanitan and Galarian Sirfetch'd to come out, and I gave it a week so that I'd have some time to actually playtest them, see how the community's playing them, and actually get a bit more time with the decks before making a very rushed decision. I must say, I am super happy with the two new decks. The variety in theme decks I've seen over the last week has been amazing. I've seen more different decks in the last week than in the previous 2 months. So I think that these two new sets coming out were an absolutely awesome addition to the game, and I'm very happy with them. So without further ado, let's get into the list. So, for me, sitting at number 10 is going to be the Zacian Summon Center decks. For me, these haven't changed that much, and I still think that they are very neck and neck. I've got very similar win-loss ratios with these two decks. They both kind of fill in the same role in the meta, which is kind of frustrating, but it is what it is. So these two decks, Zacian Summon Center, pros. They don't have many filler Pokemon. The decks are pretty well-rounded, and there's a reason to use all of the Pokemon in the deck. Like, they each kind of fit their own role. So overall, you're not really throwing away Pokemon very often with these decks. So in that sense, they're really well constructed. These decks are pretty reliable. I've had very few games where these decks haven't performed, at least to some degree. So generally speaking, you'll get your answers off with these decks. And good synergy. One of the nice things with having not many filler Pokemon is the decks work very well with each other. So all in all, they are both really well constructed decks. They work well, they flow well, they play pretty easily as well, which is always a good thing with these theme decks, because the theme deck meta, as much as is a standalone area to play in, and I do enjoy playing in the theme deck format itself, it is also a great place for newer players to start their collection and start learning the game. And in that sense, these two decks are awesome. Now, these decks do have their cons, and bad typing is certainly one of them. Metal typing is still a very awkward typing, because Cinderace is still a viable deck. Blazing Volcano, whilst I'm actually not seeing it that often anymore, is still a relatively viable deck. And Relentless Flame is still a very well played deck, and a deck you'll often run up into on the versus ladder. So because of that, the metal typing makes it very awkward. That being said, it's also the fact that the electric type Pokemon resist it, which is going to be a problem further down this list. Another con is that it's got very average damage, both of these decks. Not counting like late game, but you're early in your mid game, the damage isn't great. You're going to be struggling to deal more than 120 damage with these decks, which is a problem. So be very careful with how you play the game. Good matchups with these decks. Willowboom, pretty easy matchup because you resist the damage. If you're able to get online quickly, it works quite well. Galarian Darmanitan, being weak to steel, makes these two decks perform relatively well against the majority of the Galarian Darmanitan deck. And then Tropical Takedown, again, this deck works quite well against it. In terms of bad matchups, fire decks. You don't want to see them. AntiIndepth, hitting a bench is always a problem. Towering Heights and Stormcaller, again, really great decks and really tough to take down with these two decks. Moving on to our number 9 spot is the Leaf Charge deck. This is a deck that I've actually seen get a lot more play recently, and especially now with the release of the two Galarian decks. Now, this deck is great typing. Being Grass and Lightning makes it fantastic against both of those two new decks, and it does give it decent coverage against decks like Towering Heights and even Soaring Storm. So overall, the typing of this deck is really good. One of the big selling points of this deck is that it loves going second. Now, this deck runs Lily, which is absolutely fantastic for going second, and it runs Manectric, which is a stage 1 Pokemon that allows you to play it as your first active Pokemon if you're going second. Now again, you have to draw it in your opening hand. Same with Lily. But if you do, you're generally going to have a pretty good game. So a lot of things have gone right for this deck recently. That change to no supporters in the first turn, which means going second is that much better. And those 2 new Galarian decks that came out makes this deck perform that much better. Generally, it has a pretty good energy game. The fact that it has Experience Share, the fact that it has a Bomber Snow, the fact that it has Lantern, the fact that it has Lady, you're generally having a pretty good electric game. And you can speed it up even further with, again, that Manectric, which allows you to attach 2 energies after it attacks. So overall, the deck runs really, really well in terms of energies. It's got pretty decent damage. Nothing to really write home about, but it can get really good. Sceptile can hit like an absolute truck. Because it deals an additional 20 damage per energy down on your opponent's active Pokemon. So it can do well, but you've got to be careful with your energy game for it to do well. This deck does have cons though. It is very vulnerable to bench snipe. Because you need to have a lot of energies on your bench, if your opponent has a way of hitting your bench, you're in trouble. And it's also very vulnerable to gusting. So if your opponent is able to switch out your active Pokemon with one of your bench Pokemon, Escape Rope, Guzma, Pokemon Catcher, anything like that, this deck struggles against that because you need to protect your bench. And if your opponent has a way of hitting your bench and hitting your energies, this deck really struggles. This deck does rely on evolutions quite a lot. You want to get your stage 1s and your stage 2s out there. You need your Bomber Snows, you need your Manectrics, and you need your Sceptile. So it can play a little bit slowly, so you've got to be aware of that when using this deck. This deck can have a really bad early game. Ideally, you want to get your energy accelerated as quickly as possible. And now if that doesn't happen, the deck will only really perform mid and late game. Your early game damage is relatively low, so you've got to be very aware and try and ramp up as quickly as possible. In terms of your good matchups, you're good against both the Galarian decks because of your typing, and again against Towering Heights because of your typing. Bad matchups, AntiIndepth, Bench Snipe, and Relentless Flame typing. Alright, moving on to our next spot, spot 8, is the Galarian Darmanitan deck. Now, this is one of the new decks. It hasn't been posted that high up on the list, but I still think it's a relatively decent deck. I've got a relatively good win rate with it. I mean, 60% in the first week. Whilst not fantastic, it's not bad. There is one very key point to note with this deck, and that's the first con, which is that the card list of this deck may change. The digital version of this deck has Air Balloon and Lucky Egg, whilst the physical version of this deck has Sonya and Capacious Bucket instead. Now, one of the main reasons this deck performs so well for me is the fact that it has Air Balloon and Lucky Egg. If this was essentially switched and the digital version didn't have them, I do think this would be ranked lower or even not on the list. So this is also one of the reasons why this video took a week to come out, is I was waiting to see if this card would be errated, if this deck would be errated. It hasn't after a week. I'm not aware if that change is going to happen or not. If it does happen, this deck will move down significantly, as those two cards really make this deck shine. However, if they do remain in this deck, this is actually an alright deck that, whilst it can be difficult to play, it can be very rewarding to play it. Now, it's got a pretty decent typing in the fact that it's a water type deck. Again, you're going to be seeing quite a few Relentless Flames, less so since these decks came out, but it is a deck you do see run into quite regularly. So being a water type deck is always a good thing. This deck has fantastic trainers. Bird Keeper is awesome. Absolutely awesome, as is Turbo Patch. Now, Turbo Patch is a bit finicky as it's a coin flip, which is always a bit 50-50. But it can be very good. This deck draws amazingly because it's got such great supporters. In terms of that, it's also got a pretty decent energy game. Now, Wingull, for example, allows you so not Wingull, Pelipper allows you with 3 energies to do 110 damage, and then you're moving an energy from Pelipper to one of your benched Pokemon. Now that's a nice thing because it allows you to move your energies around, get a strong attack off, and if your opponent does then knock out Pelipper, at least you're saving an energy. Now that's a very good thing. The other Pokemon like Kangaskhan, so only 2 energies, and with Rally Back it can deal up to 120 damage. So it has a fairly good energy game, also because it runs Bede and Turbo Patch, but you've got to play it very carefully. Bede only puts energies on your bench. Turbo Patch only puts energies in basic Pokemon. So, as I've said in the cons list, this deck punishes bad plays. You have to be very aware when playing this deck, and you have to be on top of your game. This deck has an absolutely awesome retreat game because of Air Balloon and because of Birdkeeper. Now again, if the deck list changes, this will change. But as it is now, you're able to retreat with this deck very well, which allows you to preserve your own Pokemon and also outplay your opponent, which is a big part of this deck. So again, you've got to make those good plays, but it can be incredibly rewarding. Overall, this deck hits very, very hard. Beartic 150, Galarian Darmanitan 80, 170, Suicune 130. This deck overall does pretty decent damage. So you should be able to get a lot of knockouts relatively easy. I mean, Galarian Darmanitan knocks out Nidoqueen in a single attack. Knocks out Dragonite in a single attack. So the damage is there for this deck. Cons, as I've said, the list may change, and it does punish bad plays. You have to be aware of playing this deck. This deck can also be quite draw reliant. Now, it draws very well. However, if you don't run into those draws, you're gonna be in a lot of trouble. This deck relies on having card advantage. It relies on drawing a lot of cards. If you don't get that engine going, you're in trouble. In terms of good matchups, it does well against your fire type decks, Blazing Volcano, Cinderace, and Relentless Flame. However, it can be a bit of an awkward matchup against Stormcaller and Soaring Storm. Those lightning Pokemon really put a damper on you, and the paralysis coming out of Stormcaller is a big problem with this deck. Not being able to retreat can really shut you down. Next up in spot 7 is Willowboom. Now, this is a deck that personally I do love. So there is a bit of bias there, and I will admit it. That being said, I think this deck is in a very good spot post Galarian decks. And the reason for that is that Relentless Flame is seeing a little bit less play, which means Rillaboom does a lot better, because one of the main things that was shutting down Rillaboom was the abundance of Relentless Flame players. And now because there is less people playing Relentless Flame, this deck is doing a lot better. And this deck performs very well against Towering Heights, and it performs very well against not the Manatan, the Surf Edge deck. So because those decks are also seeing a bit more play, Rillaboom does better. Now this is a great deck because it has fantastic energy acceleration. You're able to get energies down the board quicker than almost any other deck out there. So you're able to really get board presence over your opponent. This deck has good normal mons in the sense that it has Snorlax, which is absolutely amazing. This deck hits incredibly hard. This deck also hits incredibly hard. From your Snorlax to your Rillaboom, you're going to be knocking out most of your opponent's Pokemon with a single attack, which is incredibly good. And because the deck plays very quickly with energy acceleration, you're able to play a very aggressive game. By playing a very aggressive game, you can shut down your opponent before they have time to establish themselves. So you've really got to focus on getting those energies down there, and then essentially just sweeping your opponent's board as quickly as possible. Now unfortunately, this deck does still have a relatively bad typing in the sense that it's grass. So it does badly against both Zamazenta and Zacian, and it does badly against any fire type decks. It can be an awkward game with your Snorlax against Towering Heights and against Galarian Surf Edge decks, so be a bit careful with that. This deck can be a bit luck reliant. You need to get that energy acceleration out there, and if you don't, this deck can play a little bit slowly. So again, you need good draws to get this deck offline. To get this deck online, sorry. In terms of good matchups, as sort of mentioned before, it does work quite well against Unseen Depths, works well against Stormcaller, and works well against Intellium. Now, however, unfortunately, the bad matchup is the Soaring Storm deck, as well as all fire type decks. I do expect this deck to do a little bit better in the future because of the way the meta is changing. So this is definitely a deck you can keep an eye on, and hopefully we're going to see it improving. Next up is spot number 6. Just missing out on the top 5 is Laser Focus. Now, this is actually a deck that caught me a little bit by surprise for the post-Galarian rotation, is that this deck is seeing a lot of play. And it's seeing a lot of play because it does really well against Galarian Surfetched, and it does really well against Towering Heights. Mainly just because it shuts down Thrall. That's the reason that's enough to play this deck, just to shut down Thrall against Towering Heights. Now, I've had a bit of a mixed bag with this deck. I've seen a lot of people playing with it and doing really, really well with it, but I've also been on some pretty bad loss streaks with this deck. Now, this deck has absolutely fantastic energy recycling. The fact that Malamar can bring back those psychic energies from your discard pile back onto your bench is amazing, and it has one of the best energy games out of any deck out there. This deck also has a very high damage count. You're generally dealing 90 plus damage with your attacks, which is a very, very good thing. So you're able to put damage out there. That being said, you're not able to get normally above 120, with the exception of Weakness Guard on Necrozma. Generally, you're topping out at about 120, which is a little bit of an awkward range. This deck is pretty good fetch in the fact that you're able to bring out your Pokemon relatively well. You can fill up your bench because there's a lot of call abilities for your basic Pokemon onto your bench, as well as the Mysterious Charm to bring out Malamar or Necrozma if you really need it. This deck can play very aggressively because it's able to recycle its energies. So losing your Pokemon isn't the end of the world because you can bring them back. You can retreat pretty easily and then attach that energy back on again. So overall, this deck does play quite well in that sense. And as I just said now, this game switches very well because it also does allow you to reduce the cost of your retreats and make those retreats free. So you're able to get your Pokemon out of danger very easily, and you're able to get your draw mechanics working that much better. The biggest con for this deck is it relies on Weakness Guard energy. Now there's 2 copies in the deck. If you're not able to get those out, this deck struggles. If you do manage to get them out, this deck does really well. So this deck does rely on luck. So you've got to minimize that as much as possible. So you've got to focus on getting those draws out, and you've got to focus on protecting the Necrozma until you can get Weakness Guard down, because you need it to be dealing more than 120 damage. Good matchups. This deck does well against most decks, and it does very well against Galarian Surfetched. Now, this deck does well because you can get the energy acceleration going, and if you can get Weakness Guard down. However, some bad matchups. Stormcaller can be quite difficult for this deck. The paralysis and hitting your bench, big problem. Towering Heights, whilst you do knock out Thrall relatively easy, the rest of the deck can hit you quite hard, and the fact that you're only dealing 120 damage for most of your attacks is an issue. Being weak to fighting is yet again another issue. And Soaring Storm again hits this deck really hard, and this deck doesn't like its bench being hit, which Soaring Storm does very well. Alright everyone, now finally into the top 5. In the number 5 spot is actually Stormcaller. This is a deck that I've been seeing is getting a lot more play post Galarian, and one of the main reasons for it is it does very well against Galarian Darmanitan. This is a really interesting deck to play, as it's got great shutdown. There aren't many decks in the meta that deal with special conditions. Stormcaller is the king of special conditions for the theme. Now, it does so because there's a lot of cards that paralyze, a few cards that confuse. paralysis is an absolute problem in the theme format because there's not as many ways to switch. There's not as many ways to deal with special conditions. So being able to paralyze your opponent's Pokemon is a huge advantage. This deck draws very well as well, in the fact that it's able to discard its hand and draw 4 cards. Huge bonus. So generally you're able to draw relatively well and get to a pretty low deck count by the end of the game. This deck is able to hit the bench. It's able to hit the bench very, very well, which makes this deck great at bench sniping and getting rid of those decks who rely on having energies on the bench or having support Pokemon on the bench. Generally speaking, this deck has a low energy cost for their attacks. Most of your Pokemon only need 2 energies. That being said, you use your energies quite often with Ampharos. So you've got to be careful with how you play your energy game. And I've said before, this is the best status effect deck in Standard. If you enjoy playing with status effects, I would highly recommend that you pick this deck up. It's a lot of fun, and you can really shut down your opponent with it. Now, as I've said, this deck is a bit energy reliant, in the sense that you want to get Ampharos out, and you want Ampharos to use his Pokemon ability to discard 2 energies from your hand into the lost zone, to then paralyze your opponent. So you want to get those energies out, and you want to play with them very carefully. Now, one of the key points of this deck is that it needs to get Ampharos out as soon as possible, because it relies on Ampharos to get energies in the lost zone. It's the only way you can get energies in the lost zone, and you need those there to get Raikou online. Because of that, this deck does tend to play a little bit slower. This deck only really comes online in the mid game, but that being said, once it's there, it's in a very good spot and it can be incredibly difficult to deal with. In terms of good matchups, it does well against Inteleon because of the typing, and the same goes for Galarian Darmanitan. Soaring Storm and most Steel type decks it does well against because it resists the Steel type decks, and Soaring Storm because it's able to hit Tornadus, is that much better. In terms of bad matchups, Towering Heights can be a bit of a problem because of the typing. Blazing Volcano, while I don't see the deck very often, it can shut this deck down quite efficiently. And Relentless Flame, if Relentless Flame plays aggressively, and the same goes for Blazing Volcano, it can really shut down Stormcaller. Overall though, I'm happy that a lot more people are playing this deck because I think it's a really, really cool deck, and I'm glad to see its potential finally shining. Alright everybody, in the number 4 spot is Unseen Depths. Unseen Depths is an absolutely fantastic deck, got a lot of love, a lot of people love playing it, and it plays really reliably. It's got a good typing being a water type deck, it's got great control and great bench snipe. Empoleon is the MVP of this deck. You should be aiming to get Empoleon out as soon as possible, because it covers all your bases. It shuts down basic Pokemon, it deals a lot of damage, and it bench snipes. Focus on getting Empoleon out. This deck is able to energy accelerate through Kyogre to be able to get energies from your discard pile back onto Kyogre or back onto any of your other Pokemon. So it has a relatively good energy game, which again allows it to play relatively aggressively. The deck draws pretty well. It's got a few good draw Pokemon and a few good draw supporters. So generally you should be having a decent game and you should be able to get Empoleon out relatively easily. Across the board, especially with Empoleon, this deck has a relatively low energy cost to get those attacks off. Empoleon usually is only using 1 energy. That enables you to get those energies elsewhere, like on Kyogre or on Ambipom. Unfortunately, this deck does require Empoleon to shine. If you essentially prize your Empoleons, or you just don't get them out, you're going to struggle to pick up a win with this deck. Unless you have Ambipom, this deck tends to play a relatively slow early game. It does shine a bit later mid to late game, but that being said, if you're able to get Ambipom on turn 2, you're probably going to be picking out a knockout. Now, good matchups, this deck does well against all fire type decks, and any deck that relies on bench support. Because you're able to hit the bench so efficiently, it does incredibly well with knocking out those support Pokemon on the bench, like Malamar. In terms of bad matchups, Willowboom is a little bit awkward because of typing, and because Willowboom can also play really aggressively, If Willowboom comes online early, you're going to struggle with it. Towering Heights, again, a bit of an awkward matchup. Soaring Storm in any aggro deck. One of the biggest things that this deck suffers with is aggression. If you're not able to get set up quickly, you're in trouble. So be very aware if your opponent's playing an aggressive deck that you need to focus on getting that Empoleon out, and you need to focus on getting established as quickly as possible. Now, into our top 3. Towering Heights for me is picking up the number 3 spot. This is just an absolutely fantastic deck. It's a deck that you can pick up and play relatively easily, and it hits hard and it plays really, really well. It's got great typing in being a fighting type deck, as it's effective against most normal type Pokemon out there. It's got great energy acceleration thanks to Groudon. It's got fantastic synergies in the fact that this deck is able to put damage counters on the bench, which it then wants to power up Thrall or to power up Seismitoad. This deck plays incredibly aggressively. If your opponent makes some bad plays and push damage on your bench early, or push damage on your first active Pokemon, and you're able to switch in a Thrall on turn 2, you're probably getting knockouts from turn 2 with Thrall. So be very careful when you're playing against this deck not to put damage counters on your opponent's bench unnecessarily, because your opponent will be able to use them against you. It's got a great comeback mechanic in the sense that Garchomp deals more damage if your opponent has less prize cards than you. So you're able to claw back games pretty well with this deck. This deck has bench protection in the form of Mew. This is one of the only decks in the game that has bench protection. So it really is a huge advantage to a deck that can sometimes put a lot of damage counters on its own bench and make itself vulnerable. So make sure you get Mew on the bench, make sure that Mew doesn't leave your bench. In terms of con, it requires that you want damage on your bench. So you need to be retreating your Pokemon or putting damage counters onto your own bench to make sure that you're able to essentially power up your Pokemon. This deck can be very weak to gusting. If your opponent is able to pull out Pokemon that are on your bench and deal with them, you're going to have a bad time. Because your bench Pokemon tend to have damage counters on them, it means that if your opponent is able to hit your bench or able to drag out those Pokemon, it's going to hurt. In terms of good matchups, this deck performs relatively well against AntiIndepth and Soaring Storm if you're able to get Mew out. In terms of bad matchups, Willowboom, bad typing, plus Willowboom can be very aggressive. Soaring Storm and Relentless Flame, again, aggressive natures and very heavy hitting Pokemon. Up to our final 2, second place is Relentless Flame. Now, there's not much else to say about Relentless Flame. It's got great fetch support as Nidoqueen. It's got 2 of the heaviest hitters in the game, being Nidoqueen and Charizard, who are able to hit very hard, very quick, and can really make your opponent's life miserable. Once it's set up, it is very, very difficult to beat. Don't give Relentless Flame time. If you're playing against Relentless Flame, don't let your opponent set up. You're gonna pay for it. And if you're playing Relentless Flame, you want to be buying yourself time with Pokemon like Rapidash, which can slow the game down and give you time to get those stage 2s out. As I said now, this deck has fantastic stall in the form of Rapidash. Rapidash dealing 60 damage and possibly not taking damage on your next turn is huge, because you're buying time to get your other Pokemon online. You're buying time to fetch your stage 2s, which is amazing. This deck does require a setup, so you need to be getting those Pokemon out, and if you don't, it can be very difficult. As I said, this deck relies on those evolution Pokemon, so you're tending to play a slower game unless you have absolutely amazing luck in your early game and some really great draws. Now, this deck is quite luck reliant. It's reliant on getting good draws and getting your setup online. With Relentless Flame, you tend to have either a really good game or an incredibly difficult one. Rarely is there a middle ground with this deck. So be careful playing this deck, as it relies a lot of the time on coin flips in terms of Rapidash and Timer Ball. And you need those good draws, and you need to make sure you do not prize Nidoqueen or Charizard. Good matchups, most decks. Charizard can deal with most Pokemon in the meta, and as can Nidoqueen. So if you're able to set up, you'll probably thrash most decks out there. In terms of bad matchups, AntiIndepth, bad typing, and it can hit your bench. Soaring Storm, again, it can hit your bench and very high damage. And then Galarian, Darmanitan, and Tellian, typings. The number one spot for this month is Soaring Storm. Again, nothing's really changed. This is an absolutely fantastic deck. Wasn't really affected by the 2 new Galarian decks coming out. It still performs really, really well. And it's just a super reliable deck. This is the deck I've had the most success with recently in events, as well as the deck I use to grind the versus ladder if I'm looking for those Pokecoins or I'm looking for a specific reward. In terms of the good things about this deck, it's got absolutely awesome draw in the terms of Pidgeotto, its Grimer, and its supporters. This deck plays well. You're able to get your answers out relatively easily. This deck can play very aggressively with Tornadus and Thundurus. If you're able to get the 2 Genies out, Jins out very early, it's very difficult to shut this deck down. And if you're able to get those 2 out early with Dragonite to get those energy accelerations off that much earlier, you're not going to lose the game unless your opponent plays really well or if you make some really poor decisions. This deck has good energy recycling in the form of Lantern and Fisherman. Lantern keeps those energies in play, and Fisherman's able to put those back into your hand to use as fuel for Dragonite. Next up, you got the Bench Snipe from Thundurus. Awesome Bench Snipe if you're able to get it online. 20 damage to... Sorry, not Thundurus, Tornadus. Bench Snipe hitting all your opponent's Pokemon for 20 every single turn is absolutely awesome. And the MVPs of this deck really are Dragonite, Tornadus, Thundurus, and Pidgeotto. Don't neglect Pidgeotto. Pidgeotto's draw is huge, and it really, really does make a difference. In terms of cons, this deck is a bit draw reliant. You need to get that Dragonite out there, and you need to be drawing a lot of energies. So make sure you've got systems in play to draw as many cards as possible. And as I just said now, this deck relies on energies. You need a lot of energies to get this deck online. So you want to get your Dragonite out there as a supporter to get those energies down. And you want to get those Pidgeottos out there to get the more draws in, to get more chances to get more energies. In terms of good matchups, this deck performs well against most decks. Generally, if you've got a good setup, you should be okay with any deck because you've got the Dragon typing, normal typing, and Lightning typing. So overall, you should be doing relatively well. In terms of bad matchups, Towering Heights can sometimes be a problem if they're able to get the heads up on you and start hitting you really, really aggressively. And because the typing as well can be a bit awkward. Stormcaller, the paralysis really hurts this deck, as does hitting the bench. Because you do hit your own bench every now and again, so the fact that Stormcaller puts in more damage on your bench makes it that much more awkward. AntiIndepth, again, same thing. Because you put damage counters on your bench, the extra damage from Empoleon can finish off some of your Pokemon, which can be a bit awkward. So, this is my top 10 for August. I put these together from my personal experience using the decks, as well as decks I've gone up against, in combination with the information I've gathered from my Discord, which as always I really do appreciate. So let me know what your opinion is. This really is subjective, and this is my opinion on August's top 10. I always love going through the comments and hearing what everyone else thinks, if they agree with my list, how they would change my list, and always that constructive criticism is always really, really appreciated. If you enjoyed this video, please do consider checking out my channel, giving a like, subscribe. I'm putting out a lot of content for Pokemon theme, I'm getting into standard, and yeah, really, really informative, and got a good community going, especially on my Discord, which I'd highly recommend checking out, especially if you're a newer player. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. Cheers. Enjoy.